What's going on, everybody? Welcome back to For the Millie. I am Alex Blickle at AlexBlickle1 on Twitter, joined by my good buddy TwoGun, 5-time Millie Maker winner. And we got a great show in store. Good to see you, First Sight, Albert, and Deacon. You guys are always in here. We appreciate that a ton. And you guys are right. It's not just time for a good night. It's time for another great night because we have been on a bit of a heater on these smaller slates, whether it's Pick Six, whether it's Showdown. We've been doing pretty well, and hopefully we can continue to do so tonight. Where we're going to start, though, is talking about the main slate and just how this slate as a whole sets up. Then we'll get into the Showdown analysis, and then we will talk Pick Six as usual. So, TwoGun, where I want to start here is this seems like the first slate where there's actually a bunch of offense projected, right? It's not that we just think one or two stacks separates from the rest. There are a handful of stacks in really good spots, a lot of, I think, receivers as well in good spots. And it seems like DraftKings has responded to the lack of offense so far this year with some softer pricing. So now all of a sudden it's like there's just value all over the place. Very curious how you're going to attack this slate.
Yeah, to be honest, I'm probably going to try to wait a lot. Try to not really form too many opinions until Saturday morning, because I don't really know if there's like any major injury news or anything. Apparently, Devontae Adams isn't playing until he's on a new team, clearly. But we see what's going on with these. We can also wait and see how chalky some of these games will be, because I can see people going crazy for the 49ers game.
Mm-hmm.
And I think less so with the Rams-Packers game. I think definitely people and perhaps with the Texans game, everyone's going to feel they're going to need to have like Nico Collins, or I don't know if there's a bill that people are going to really feel they need to have. But
it might be Josh Allen. Who knows?
Yeah, and then you got the Bengals.
Mm-hmm.
I just think I kind of want to see where everything rests, and it's one of those situations where you don't need to get too cute with your contrarian plays. I'm very much guilty of doing that too much, where I like lock in on having to go with almost like the stupidest idea possible just to be different. Since there's so many games and opportunities that might have offense, you just kind of have to look for some offense that might be overlooked instead of thinking, oh, maybe this kind of dead game could just end up shooting out.
I think it's a really good week for the chalk stack in a contrarian way mantra. Instead of just trying to find a game that's totally overlooked, it's what's a game that projects really well where one of the players is really overlooked and can kind of make that stack into something great. But as you said, there's Baltimore, Cincinnati, there's Houston, Buffalo, there's a Cleveland team against Washington. There's Washington against a Cleveland team that's probably without Myles Garrett. There's Green Bay, Los Angeles. There's a lot of potential offense on this slate. So I love the point you made. Let's wait. Let's be patient. Let's see what ownership looks like. Because if so many teams project well, if so many players project well, it's going to be who's the guy at 4% instead of 15%. Kind of like, as Brett pointed out here, Gary Woodland right now 7 under on the golf course, starting out really well for us. Love the multi-sport interest that we have here at FTN. PJ has been so much fun, and the GPP scores have obviously been a big part of that. I think the last thing that I'll say for the main slate this week is I want to be really purposeful when I'm getting contrarian. I don't think it's a week to be contrarian for the sake of being contrarian and just playing someone at 5% because we think, hey, this guy's at 5% and he could really break the slate. It's when you are being contrarian, the best way to do it is to leverage some other chalk on the slate that you're not using, because so much of the chalk is going to project well, and we have to kind of get lucky that we pick the right chalk. And one of the ways we can do that is by when we do get contrarian around that good chalk, if our contrarian plays hit, that's automatically hurting some of the chalk. Otherwise, it's just going to be really hard to land on the perfect combinations.
Yeah. It's really easy to get too extreme, like get too chalky or get too contrarian. It's often trying to, play in that middle. But that's often that's generally where the best winning is long term.
Yep. Yeah, not just being in the middle, but that balance, right? The balance between high probability plays and the contrarian upside plays. So something we talk about a ton here at FTN. With that, let's jump in to the showdown. I don't think we have many other main slate takes. It's a little bit early to talk about potential slate breakers because, as we keep talking about, it's about ownership this week. So it's much less about, hey, I'm locked in on this player or this stack, and I don't think they're going to get the interest. We kind of know where the public is generally going to go this week. It's just a matter. There are too many players, too many stacks project well for them all to be popular. Somebody has to slip through the cracks, and we just kind of want to wait and see who actually does. So, TwoGun, this showdown, I think it's going to be a pretty fun game. But one of the reasons why it's a fun game is because both of these offenses have a number of options to go to. So it's a little bit tough to kind of figure out exactly where people are locking in ownership-wise. But also, do you have any strong takes on the players that you like tonight?
I don't know if I have strong takes on any players. I think this is a game with a 43.5 total that most people think is like a 49 total. So I think everyone's going to be very thinking, high passing, Baker Mayfield overs, lots of scoring. I could see it being a little bit more tame. I could also see it possibly being a blowout. I guess the Falcons blowing them out. So I have, two lineups. One of them is a Falcons blowout. The other is more balanced. The other thing I'll point out is there's one guy on this slate that everyone hates. Most people, like most of the other players, will like just fine, but there's clearly one player that is very hated. And I feel like I have to use him at least in one of my lineups, but I don't really want to, which just shows how hated he is. And I think we both
player is.
Who do you think I'm talking about?
I think you're talking about Kyle Pitts.
Oh, I'm definitely talking about Kyle Pitts.
Okay. I'm glad we're on the same page there. It's funny because I think you're right that people have kind of completely turned on him and don't want to use him. But I also think that there are so many players on the slate that could have applied to. For example, it could have applied to Rachaad White. I think people are excited about the potential emergence of Bucky Irving, but I think in large part people are saying, oh, I'm not sure which Tampa Bay running back it would be, so I might as well just go to the receivers because I know it's going to be Godwin and Evans. So it's again, like, it's a little bit hard to figure out exactly where people are going to go, but it's sometimes a little easier to figure out where they're not going to go, and certainly Kyle Pitts is not going to be popular tonight. Yeah,
it's but the question is like, is everyone just right at this point about Kyle Pitts? Like, is there? I mean, I saw something on Twitter, like it was like making fun of all Kyle Pitts's targets, like showing how he gets absolutely no separation. I mean, it's funny, like everyone loved Kyle Pitts in best ball. I wasn't really on him, but I guess thankfully. But at this point, they turned on him. I mean, I can't say they're wrong. Like, I'm not going to be like, no, everyone's wrong. I'm going to take a shot on him in one or two lineups, I think. I'm not going to put him on both of my lineups. I'm like not like a Kyle Pitts truther by any means. But I feel like Ray McCloud is going to be exceedingly high owned, I think, because he's so cheap and he seems to people are like, oh, he's going to get there, he's going to get the targets, blah, blah, blah. And Kyle Pitts is cheap, but Ray McCloud's cheaper.
Yeah.
So why?
This is a perfect time to bring up the DVOA adjusted fantasy points against data, because I think both of these teams' defenses paint a pretty clear picture about how they're defending. So let me just make sure you guys can see all this right up on the screen. If we scroll down here to Tampa Bay, check this out. So let me blow this up a little bit just so you guys have an easier time seeing it. Tampa Bay is allowing 20% more production than average to opposing quarterbacks, and yet it's not coming where you would usually expect that. Wide receiver ones are down 8%, tight ends down 23%, wide receiver twos down 57%, and yet wide receiver threes, who actually are all other wide receivers, so anyone who doesn't get categorized as wide receiver one or wide receiver two gets categorized as wide receiver three, they're producing, which kind of tells me, okay, Tampa Bay is saying, whether it's about the strength of their corners or whether it's more a philosophical approach of theirs where they're saying we're not going to let you beat us in the way that you want to beat us. We're going to force you to find those peripheral guys and beat us through them. When you look at Atlanta, like obviously that means Ray McCloud, but I think there's also an argument to be made that Kyle Pitts isn't really a tight end. He doesn't line up at tight end. He lines up mostly in the slot, even sometimes outside, and he's not getting treated with the attention that some of these receivers are. And Darnell Mooney has really kind of established himself. So I think there's an argument to be made that it's not just Ray McCloud who fits in this wide receiver 3 category. It's Kyle Pitts, in which case that could really come to fruition tonight and make him a solid play. What do you think of that, TwoGun?
I mean, I think you're right. I think most people would look at that and be like, yep, Ray McCloud. Mm-hmm. But it could be Kyle Pitts as well. He's a great leverage play off of Ray McCloud too, I will add.
Yeah.
I just think
basically any of the receivers too, off of Mooney, off of Drake London. Like if Kyle Pitts finally has that, 8 reception on 12 targets for a 110-yard game, which at this point it almost seems like completely out of the realm of possibilities, but we've seen that from him in the past. It's not like he isn't capable at this level, and he's got a better quarterback than he's had. So I do still think it's in his range of outcomes. It just is a little bit less likely to actually show up than what we were expecting.
Outcomes? I don't know. Like, I mean, obviously, I'm like a Kyle Pitts truther for a night. Let's call it that. Like, I'll hit it for an. It's a bad analogy. You know what I'm saying? Like, I'm pro Kyle Pitts tonight, but if I'm wrong, let's just say I'm not going to be shocked.
Oh, 100%. You can't be shocked if Pitts continues to struggle.
How do you not try it? Like, how do you not try a zero not a zero, but like a sub 20% Kyle Pitts on a?
Yeah, I mean, I think from a football perspective, one of the reasons why it's in his range of outcomes is because we know that Tampa's defense, they kind of like to stick to whatever their game plan was, at least coming in. So if Atlanta kind of sees a matchup advantage with Pitts early, I don't think Tampa Bay is going to be quick to make an adjustment to that. I think they're going to continue to say, let's take London out of the game. Let's take Mooney out of the game. And if, Cousins historically has been one to lock in on guys when it's working, whether that was Justin Jefferson or Hawkinson in the past few years. That's kind of been an MO of his as well. So I think there's a chance for it. Obviously, we're not saying like lock in on Pitts because he's about to have a huge night. It just means the likelihood of it is, I think, certainly higher than his ownership makes it seem like.
Well, let's just say if Kyle Pitts has a huge night, I'm probably going to have a huge night.
There you go.
And you can't say that very often for most players.
Yeah. Let's also take a look at the Atlanta defense, because I think the picture that this DVOA data is pointing about the Atlanta defense is much clearer. Just like with Tampa Bay, we see a really nice matchup for quarterbacks. With Atlanta, though, the running back matchup is pretty bad. Tight end matchup is bad. Wide receiver 2s and wide receiver 3 matchups are really bad. And they've been kind of decimated by wide receiver 1s, whether that was Devontae Smith when A.J. Brown was out, Rashee Rice. It's been a really, really nice spot for opposing wide receiver 1s. Chris Olave just had a nice game as well. So to me, that's Mike Evans. Now, I do think you can make an argument that, well, when you look at the wide receiver 1s who have had success against them, like Rashee Rice, that role certainly closer to the Chris Godwin role. So part of the value of this data is that we do allow some subjectivity into it when we're defining who's the wide receiver 1, who's the wide receiver 2. Unfortunately, that also means that there are times where it kind of makes it a little bit more difficult to figure out who is that guy in that specific game. So are you leaning towards Evans or Godwin?
I don't know. Like, it's one of those things, like Evans is $200 more. So rarely do you need that $200 on Godwin. Do you just use Evans just so you can use that extra $200 so you feel like you have less left over? I don't really know how people are going to think for this sort of situation.
Yeah.
I really don't know. I'm generally using Evans, but I might just I think I have Evans in both right now and no Godwin, but I might just put Godwin in one and Evans in one, just because I don't know. I really just don't have a strong opinion on that.
I think that my strong opinion is I wouldn't have one if I didn't see an ownership discrepancy forming. And I don't see like a huge one forming, but I do think that Godwin is clearly going to be the more popular guy. One of the reasons for that is if you look at their pick 6 projections, Godwin's almost 9 yards. I think he's exactly 9 yards ahead of Evans. Add in the fact that Evans is the more popular one. Add in the fact that if you look at, for anyone just game log watching, 8, 8, 9, and 9. Those are the target totals for Chris Godwin. You don't see anything close to that consistency with Mike Evans, which I kind of like, right? 6, 6, 3, and then 14 targets. But the thing with Evans is we know the explosiveness exists. We know the 150-yard, 2-touchdown ceiling exists with him. So certainly I would say Evans is better captain play. I think you can make an argument that Godwin is better as a flex, particularly if you're like going heavy on Atlanta and you're just looking for 1 or 2 bringbacks on the Tampa side. Maybe that's when you go to Godwin. But I am definitely more inclined to call Mike Evans the wide receiver 1 on the offense. And I know that Aaron Schatz, who does the wide receiver 1 and wide receiver 2 designations, is also calling Evans the wide receiver 1.
Yeah. If I use Godwin, I would sub him in on my 5-1 Falcons. Just ideas that he gets all these like random targets. But look at where they were in best ball. Like everyone was drafting Mike Evans like 50 spots ahead of Godwin, and now they're the same all of a sudden. Like, I don't know what to say. I'm also not sure. Like, do you really think Godwin's going to be drafted a lot more than Evans? Like, what do you think the delta in their percentages are for flex or whatever?
Well, let's see. So we have Godwin third in captain ownership projected at 15.7%, Evans at 9%. Flex is a lot closer. We have Godwin at 45%, Evans at 37.5%. So I think it's going to be close to that. Honestly, I wouldn't be surprised if it's actually a little bit flipped there in the sense that they're further in flex ownership than captain ownership. Like I wouldn't be that surprised if Godwin and Evans are similarly owned as captains, but then Godwin is used, 30% of the time as a flex and Evans is only used 15% of the time as a flex or something like that. So I think that's how I'm seeing it. But the other interesting thing, just looking at overall ownership projections, particularly captain ownership, is just how much higher we have Bijan Robinson projected than anyone else. 27% as the captain, London second at 16%. Do you think, number one, Bijan is going to be that popular as a captain? And number two, do you think he's worthy of that ownership?
Yes and no is kind of how I think about it. It really only makes sense to captain him like that. I think if you're maybe in a Falcons beatdown, I don't like using Bijan as a captain in a 3-3 sort of situation or even a 4-2.
Yeah.
But I could totally see that happening.
That's really interesting because last game we saw Tyler Algier really cut into his workload. Algier for the season is averaging 6.1 yards per carry to Bijan's 4.1. Now we see that all the time. The starter is typically, or the backup, I should say, especially if he's a good backup like Algier is, often has a higher yards per carry just because it's easier to be that efficient on fewer touches. But I think there is also something to be said about the fact that Algier is just a really, really good runner. And Bijan might be better as a pass catcher than he is a runner. Similar situation, honestly, to Tampa, where Rachaad White only plays as often as he does because of his value as a pass catcher, which earns him some carries. But if it was just about which of these two Buccaneers are better at running the ball, Bucky Irving would be the one on the field more often than White. Currently, last week, Irving got up to a 47% snap share. That was his highest of the season. So I think that's another thing that's interesting about this slate is we actually have some similarities to these backfield situations where a very talented backup is seemingly starting to eat into the workload of the starter. But obviously this ownership projection for Bijan Robinson suggests that the field is not seeing that or is not as afraid of that on the Atlanta side as they are the Tampa side.
Mm-hmm.
If you're not playing Bijan,
I kind of like using Algier in pick 6 is over. I don't really like using his under. In general, I like using unders, just not on Algier. as like a way of saying this is going to be a slow, boring Atlanta beatdown.
It could also just be a slow, boring game, right? Like I think you mentioned earlier, you said your exact words were like, people are treating this as a 49 total instead of a 43.5. And so one of the ways that it goes under the total is just there's more running than people expect. Like it seems like everyone says, oh, both of these teams can throw. It's just going to be kind of a shootout, a really high pass rate shootout. What if both of these teams just run the ball a bunch and we just get a slow game with it now at a ton of pass volume? And that would be great for Algiers. So I like that call on pick six quite a bit. On Showdown, are you using a rule where if you're not using Bijan, you're using Algiers?
No. Okay. Because I think if you do an Atlanta beatdown, you can use both.
Okay. Would you also say that if you're doing a Tampa beatdown, you can choose neither?
Of course. Or if you just use an air it out. They're an air it out type game, you use neither.
That's the side of it that that has me not wanting to institute that rule, even though I think generally speaking, there is a really nice leverage play there if you're using Algiers instead of Bijan. But I don't think you have to use Algiers every time that you're not using Bijan, because they could just fail and maybe they're throwing a bunch. Maybe it's just Kyle Pitts who's having the good offensive game. Maybe it's Ray McLeod. Maybe it's even Drake London, just because the data hasn't been favorable to wide receiver ones against Tampa so far this year doesn't mean that a wide receiver one can't have success in an individual game. So by no means can you or do you have to steer away from London. And also remember that it's just -8%. And one other thing I wanted to say, by the way, is let me actually share my screen for this. If you're interested in all of this DVOA data, you don't just need to go to that fantasy points against page. You can also just go straight to the optimizer. So here I have the Showdown up, and you see this DVOA column. This is grabbing the data for each individual player straight from that chart I was showing earlier. So here you see like Chris Godwin at -48%, Mike Evans at +44%, again, reflecting the fact that we are defining Mike Evans as the wide receiver 1, Chris Godwin as the wide receiver 2. There you see -8% for Drake London, +6% for Bijan and Algiers, et cetera, et cetera. So if you really love that data, and you should, because this data is spectacular. And I'll say that I think we're working on like a 4-game streak on these island games where the DVOA adjusted fantasy points against data has just like perfectly predicted how the game would go. So sometimes it almost seems like, we spend all this time thinking about leverage and this and that. Well, maybe we have this piece of data that can just really help us predict what's actually going to happen. But certainly I think the way to go is through leveraging and all that and thinking it through. But it really helps when we can do both of those at the same time, where we can follow this DVOA data, and it also helps leverage what other people are doing. So those are kind of the holy grail situations. And I think we have a little bit of that tonight, particularly where Godwin has this terrible matchup and Evans has this great one according to this data, and the ownership is in the other direction.
Yeah. You find your spots. Mm-hmm. That's the whole point of DFS. You try to intelligently find your spots. And you're never going to have a guarantee of anything in this game. But you can find the spots that are likely to give you a chance if you happen to get lucky and be right that night.
I think that's an awesome way to phrase it. Pick your spots. And one way I think you can look at that is like, use this data and say, okay, I want to pick my spots. I have a really good feeling about Ray McLeod tonight. You go look at the data, and the data says, hey, Ray McLeod might be in a great spot. Okay, now you're in, right? If you look at the data, maybe your thought was, I think Darnell Mooney is the lever I want to pull tonight for this slate. And then you look at the data and you see -57% for him. Maybe that's not the best spot to pick. And so then you can move off of it, look for something else that makes a little bit more sense. So you're kind of doing the best of both worlds, right? You're using this data to help you actually predict what might happen, but you're doing it in such a way where you're still following all of the roster construction kind of ideals that we talk about, all of the leverage concepts, all the correlation that we talk about. So yeah, I think pick your spot is a really good way to put it.
Mm.
By the way, I see Navari in here. TwoGun, I don't know if you were looking at the Discord chat earlier, but he had some harsh words for the Amari Cooper play these past couple of weeks, and the fact that I know I'm on him again this week. I'm guessing you are too.
Probably.
Man, like, people need to realize there was a phantom holding call that if that doesn't get called back, in the last 2 weeks, he's combined for over 200 yards and 3 touchdowns. And we'll be talking about how he's suddenly a home run play again in the best matchup possible for fantasy. So I don't want to hear all the Amari Cooper hate.
I don't care what people think. You know, like, I lost way more money on it than they did, so they can suck it if they don't like it, my call. And yeah, like, there's a phantom holding call. That's just how football works. You have big plays. If your big play gets called back, well, that sucks. And it sucked for me. That cost me a good $20,000-$30,000. So whatever. Like, you don't have to use them. I am probably going to be on them again this week. I don't see why I forgot who they're playing. I remember looking at it.
Washington, the number one matchup for
I mean, come on. Of course I'm taking against Washington.
Yeah.
It's there's going to be a time when I'm not going to tout Amari Cooper. It's not going to be this week. I'm going to be on him again this week. Maybe next week. When he's on his bye, I won't tout him. Let's leave it at that. Okay.
You're gonna just include a little preview for next week's article just so you can write about Amari Cooper that week.
Right. It's kind of like with me and DeAndre Hopkins, except he got injured or he was his snap count was limited, so I wasn't on him those few weeks. And of course he went nuts that 1 week. He had about 20 points. And then Will Levis got injured, and then they stopped throwing the ball because they just didn't need to throw the ball because the Dolphins can't throw the ball. So it just became a little boring ass shit show, which everyone thought. And sometimes everyone's right.
All right, looking at some of the cheaper plays on this slate, we have a number of very viable values. So let's run through a few of them, and we're going to talk about the flex ownership as well. 2 of these really stand out to me. So let's start here. Tyler Algier, $4,800, 20% projected ownership. Cade Otton, 4,032% projected ownership. Ray McLeod, 3,400, 45% projected ownership in the flex. Sterling Shepard down at 1,600, kind of the clear-cut wide receiver 3 for Tampa Bay today, given some injuries. Typically a team that likes to kind of rotate almost 2 to 3 guys in that wide receiver 3 spot alone. So potentially a good spot for Sterling Shepard at just 1,600, but only 12% projected ownership for him. And then Atlanta Falcons, 3.5%. Tampa Bay Buccaneers.
The ownership for the kickers there being that low.
Actually the kickers will definitely be higher than that. I'll have to give Caleb a little nudge to bump those up. But
same thing with the Falcons defense. I think that's going to be higher. I think it's kind of right directionally. Like maybe the numbers will change a little bit once those go higher. But everything else makes sense to me. I find Baker.
I'm not sure the defenses are going to be more popular because. So I think there are 2 things I look for when projecting ownership for defenses. The first is just the overall game, right? It's just how much do people think there's an advantage to actually playing the defense and scoring points that way. And I don't think it really fits the bill tonight where teams or where people are going to be confidently playing a defense. And then the second thing is they play a defense when there's just no one for them to click that they can be excited about a skill position. But again, that doesn't fit either because of McLeod, because of Sterling Shepard, because of Cade Otton, and because of kickers. So I definitely think kickers are going to be more popular than we have projected right now. I'm not sure defenses are.
Yeah, I actually kind of like the Atlanta defense because Tampa Bay likes to throw the ball. And I will say if there's one guy that's going to be knocked down in terms of use, I bet it's Rachaad White. Even though he's not expensive at 6,800. I mean, I don't know. Maybe people use him a lot because like, oh, that's a good price for Rachaad White. I just feel like Raymond McLeod's going to get like above 50%, at least higher stakes. Like that's what's going to mess up with all the other ownership because then people can kind of afford, the quarterbacks and the elite wide receivers and Bijan,
Yeah, this is one of those spots where I feel like the field is kind of lucking into a spot where they love the price of McLeod. They don't have the wide receiver 3 data that we have with that DVOA adjusted fantasy points against data. So I almost feel like they're accidentally on the great spot against this Tampa defense, which is why Pitts makes so much sense because it like that data is basically telling us the best path to McLeod not hitting if they're passing the ball well is that there's just a different other wide receiver who's benefiting instead. And as we talked about earlier, I think Kyle Pitts fits that definition quite well. So interesting note there.
Yeah. It's, you could also use Kyle Pitts and Ray McLeod, although then you're definitely like have a lot of salary left over. I think people are just going to generally use one, and it makes way more sense to use Ray McLeod. So yeah, I'm going to have Kyle Pitts. I'm not sure right now. I don't have Ray McLeod in either lineup, and I don't hate. It's not like I hate the play. It makes a whole lot of sense. It's just kind of like, he's probably not going to get a touchdown. He's probably not going to get like 20 points. He might get like 6 points, and who cares? He's just not optimal. He just ends up not being optimal. He ends up being an okay value, just not optimal.
Yeah. Good question here from Hugo. If he uses a defense in this game environment, he wants to have a rule where he's using at least one running back from the same team. I tend to agree with that. The only touchy part is particularly on the Tampa side. Like, I don't know exactly which running back correlates better with the Tampa defense. I think it's Bucky Irving, but if Rachaad White ends up with 2 touchdowns in just a really good game and you nail everything else, like you'd feel pretty silly about not just using the clear running back one on the team, at least for now, in that game script. So do you have a lean there, and what do you think of this overall rule?
Yeah, I think it's fine, to be honest.
Yeah, I don't think it's totally necessary, because I think certainly one way that a defense is going to hit on this slate is just a defensive touchdown, in which case you're not really correlating with the team's running back anyway.
Yeah. It's just kind of with like, I think you said it right with defense. The first way is people use it because they're excited about a defense or to save money.
Yeah.
And neither of those really needs the running back involved with it. And I kind of like the Atlanta defense because I do think Tampa likes to throw the ball, which gives the defense opportunity to score points. So you don't need to use it. I don't hate using it with. I mean, I find myself a tough situation where I'm using the Falcons defense and not using Algier or Bijan, but you don't have to force it.
Yeah, I'm in complete agreement there. Jordan, really appreciate the question. I have to tell you though, unfortunately, TwoGun and I, not the people to ask about fantasy football. Neither of us really play it all that much. We are all about DFS and Pick 6. What you should do, though, make sure you're subscribed to the FTN Network YouTube channel. In fact, anybody listening should go ahead and do that. Chris Meany does a great start-sit show. You can find Jeff Ratcliffe on SiriusXM Radio talking all sorts of fantasy stuff. And then just hop in the Discord, ask questions like this. Everyone's kind of ready and willing to answer those questions. Like I said, you don't even want the fantasy football advice from TwoGun and myself. We're just here to talk DFS here.
Yeah, like, don't ask me like sit advice. Like, I literally play best ball in DFS. I do not do anything involving a sit start or a waiver wire.
Yeah, this in particular was a trade question. I wouldn't even have a base idea of how people are valuing some of those guys where you might be able to find a good trade with some value there. Unfortunately, this is an interesting one. Set a rule with defense at captain. I have to have both kickers in that lineup. I would say definitely not.
You're going to have a shit ton of salary left over.
Yeah, you're going to have a lot of salary left over, but also if you have the defense at captain, you don't want sustained drives back and forth that are leading to field goals. You want defensive points. So you better be kidding. I don't know if you actually were, but you better be kidding. Why did I read that? Because you're here participating with us, and we appreciate you for that, Hugo. So let's see. Do you have any other thoughts on some of these cheapies? Like, of the names that we talked about, do you have a favorite?
No, I don't think you really need to go below. I don't think you need to use anyone cheap, to be honest.
Yeah, that's definitely one thing that I found. I think my first instinct for this slate was like, oh, I want to pivot off Bijan with Algier. I want to pivot off of, Godwin chalk with Sterling Shepard. I want to pivot off of um, McLeod, or I wanted to pivot off, Mooney in London with McLeod. And then I was building that. I was like, hey, wait a minute. I have way too much salary left over. And then I find out McLeod is going to be super chalky. So a lot of my first instincts were just kind of wrong for this one because of the way everything's priced. So very interesting. Um, I, I do want to touch a little bit more on Rashad White and Bucky Irving, because I think the first thing I'd say is I was expecting a much larger price discrepancy. 6,800 or 6,400 is kind of wild. Like I was expecting, 8,000 for Rashad White, 5,000 for Bucky Irving, something like that. But because there isn't much of a price discrepancy, I think there is going to be at least a bit of an ownership discrepancy. 45% and 24% is what we have. Sounds like you think Rashad White might not actually get to that 45% number, might be more like 30%. But do you think that if Rashad White comes in under, it's because people are going to Bucky Irving, or because people are just avoiding the backfield?
I think it's just because people are avoiding the backfield.
Okay.
And there's just so much other value that they just end up using the expensive guys.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense, in which case I think that I still prefer Bucky Irving. Do you have a preference between the two there?
No. I don't think I'm using either of them, to be honest.
Yeah, honestly, it makes sense not to. But yeah, all right. I think that's enough for Showdown. Let's talk some pick six. This is a really, really fun pick six slate. Do you have a feeling of a most popular pick that people are going to, or do you think it's more of just like a pattern of people going with more than selections kind of across the board tonight?
Yeah, I try to spend a good amount of time each week looking at the spreadsheets that you can download, when based on like what little tournaments that your pick sixes are in, and seeing what other people do in general. And I was looking at both the Mainslate and the Island games, and I will say people are doing a lot better on the Mainslate about correlating now. So you can't just expect to correlate and expect to win soon enough. Like people are already starting to learn. But on these Island games, people are very much always doing the more than. And there's certain selections that they use a lot of, and there's certain sections that they don't. Like they do a lot more of the more thans on passing yards, receiving yards, rushing yards. There's always a big discrepancy. And then people just don't really do stuff like passing attempts that much. They just kind of avoid it.
Yep.
Kicking points, people almost always do the more thans on, but not quite as much as the other things. Completions, receptions, kind of the same thing, but again, less so. Like there's just less people are doing it less, and there's the difference between more than and less than is less. People like it's the yards where they're really going the more thans, and also on the touchdowns generally. I find it interesting that they have tackles now. They have IDP stuff on this slate. My first thought is who's going to actually click those buttons?
Yeah, I think not many.
I was thinking, though, it gives you an option where I don't know jack about IDP, but I would think if you do, could you correlate receptions with like tackles from the quarterback or something like that?
Maybe, but so many receptions don't have a tackle, or they get tackled by somebody who wasn't guarding them. I don't know. I think there might be. I think there might be an edge just on being able to get these right at a high rate. We do have some really, really good IDP minds. Not me, not you, but we have them here at FTN. So maybe we'll have to call in some big guns there to give us some advice on these solo tackle picks. But in the meantime, I think we can just kind of stick with our bread and butter. One guy I want to ask you about, Baker Mayfield, here at 241.5 passing yards. That started at 243.5. So maybe that gives us an indication that people are actually taking the less on Baker Mayfield, and maybe we just go more and stack that. Like, what's your thoughts there?
I don't know if I believe it. I think it's just getting fed from their sports book. I don't think it has anything to do with what other people are clicking. Do we really think people are clicking on minus 60 or minus 59.5 for Evans or minus 68.5 for Godwin? No, they're definitely clicking the overs.
Yeah, I think the more on 59.5 might be the most popular, not because people came to pick six to choose more on Mike Evans, but because they got here and saw, wow, Evans is under 60 when London and Godwin aren't. Like that just seems like value in comparison to Godwin and London. So I do think that's probably going to be a pretty popular one to start. And I think where I would go if you're going less on Mike Evans is not to a more on Chris Godwin. You can go less with Baker Mayfield, no problem. But I think I would probably go more on Sterling Shepard and just say, what if Atlanta forces them off the wide receiver one tonight instead of onto the wide receiver one? And so maybe that's a nice approach.
Yeah, I think I'm just going left on Mayfield and Evans and thinking they're going to get stuffed.
If you do that, if you start here, what's your next move? Like, are you then trying to build a script where Tampa Bay's actually running the ball a bunch, and maybe you go more on the rushing yards for either Rachaad White or Bucky Irving? Are you going to the Atlanta side and saying, well, if Tampa's not throwing a lot, then maybe Atlanta is, and you're going, more on completions and receptions for one of these Atlanta pairings? What are your thoughts?
I think generally the way I would go is higher on one running back, like on the running backs of one team.
Mm-hmm.
And then probably less than also on Kirk Cousins and his wide receivers. Kind of just go with a running game in general.
Yeah, I do like that.
Bucky Irving is probably the easiest one to negatively correlate with. It's just like this just becomes the Bucky Irving extraordinaire game, and Kirk Cousins doesn't throw for shit either. Is how I would look at it.
I think maybe the most interesting just projection on the board is the fact that Bucky Irving is at 12 more yards than Rachaad White just for rushing yards. They're very similar on the rushing plus receiving yards, but that's surprising to me. And so I think there are going to be a number of people who wanted to take him more on Bucky Irving. They see 45.5 for him and 33.5 for Rachaad White, and they just can't get themselves to click more on Bucky Irving. So I think that's a pretty solid one. And as we talked about, that would also leverage or that would also correlate well with a Baker and an Evans less than play. So I think this is a really nice, just kind of starting three to build around when you want to get up to a six pick or anything else on the slate.
Yeah. You just kind of have to like go with it.
Mm-hmm.
When you start with a few and you don't need to force it to be a pick six. Like if you have a few, like you have to have one from each team. But once you get to a point where like, okay, this makes sense, just quit.
Yep.
Make it a pick 4, pick 5. You don't have to keep going.
Yeah, I mean the advantage to going further is that with each additional one, as long as you have another one that correlates well, the correlation overall just becomes stronger. And the other point there obviously is if you want that maybe once a month opportunity at a 100x payout, you're generally only going to get that on 6 pick plays. So, people saw that 100x payout that you got in week 1, and we're still trying to recreate that. The closest I've come is the 36x, which
that's generally about. I mean, I think it's really hard for this payout to get above 50x, unless we get a lot of weird unders going on.
Not only that, but I think we need those picks that are clearly going to be extremely popular, like in that week 1 Monday Night Football matchup where it became obvious that Deebo Samuel, more than selections, were going to be the number one thing that people were clicking by a wide margin. And so, you obviously perfectly leveraged that. I don't think we have that on this slate. I think the closest we've come to that since was that Dallas-New York game where Devin Singletary's more on rushing yards was the clear number 1 selection. And honestly, that was like the only popular pick of the night that failed. And I still got that 36x pick just because that one failed. So maybe tonight that one is Mike Evans receiving yards, but we're going to keep looking and we'll continue to discuss this in the Pick'em channel in our Discord, as well as the NFL channel of our Discord. So any other thoughts here on this showdown slate for pick 6?
No, not really.
Do you have any main slate thoughts for pick 6 yet? Like any stacks that really jump out to you, or just kind of broad generalized points about the pick 6 main slate you want to touch on?
I'm going to look at pick six, Mainslate some more, what happened last week with other people's picks. Because people are definitely getting smart about it. And I'll talk about this on my show Sunday morning with Brooke. I think I'm going to try to go for more just unique, like try to go for like be a little bit more contrarian maybe, and not just this group, that group, because what'll happen is if there's a lot of more thans stacks that hits, then the payouts will be shit. And they were hit in the first set of games last week because a lot of more than stacks hit. The Nico Collins, CJ Stroud hit, and everyone had that. So instead of it just being like, I'm going to just throw in a bunch of stacks and hope people don't correlate, I'm going to try to correlate stacks that will be more underappreciated or correlate in ways that people aren't quite doing yet. Like when we talk about like passing attempts, going lower on that and going higher on the rushing yards per team, like the defensive boring run it down the throws beat down type games. So doing a little bit more of that and doing a little bit less just like more than. I don't necessarily need to like fade the popular stacks directly, but I still kind of have to hope they fail.
Angle. One thing that I noticed last week was that the popularity of pick six stacks were very similar to the popularity of stacks just on regular old DraftKings. So, for example, as you mentioned, like the Nico Collins stack was really popular on pick six, as was the basically like any stack in that Arizona game in the afternoon. And because that game and that team underwhelmed so much, payouts on the afternoon only slate of pick six were really high. And so one thing that you can do there is you can say, all right, I want to get a little bit more contrarian with my stacks. But I think another thing you can do is just, if you can identify who the popular stacks are, stack them in the opposite direction. Less than on Kyler Murray, less than on Marvin Harrison Jr., less than on Michael Wilson last week would have been phenomenal, both in the sense that it's correlated well and that when it hits, it's going to lead to a really big payout.
Yeah, pick six might be becoming more a little bit like just DFS in general, like sooner than I thought it would.
Yeah.
But you still can go about it in different ways, whereas in DFS, if you're not using a guy, you're fading him. In pick six, you're not necessarily fading the chalk stack. You're just hoping it fails and hoping your guys win.
Right.
Or at least a part of the chalk stack fails. Because remember, if everyone's correlate, like when everyone's just throwing darts, it makes no sense necessarily to fade the chalk stack because it's not like they're having the chalk stack. They might use like just Nico Collins, but they're not using CJ Stroud too. Now they're using both CJ Stroud and Nico Collins. So you don't need them both to fail. You just need one of them to fail.
Yep, very good point. Very good point. All right. I think that will do it. We will see you in the Discord, and then we will see you again this weekend. TwoGun will be live for free, 9:30 a.m. Eastern on Sunday, and then we'll be together at 10 o'clock, paywalled as usual. So thanks for tuning in. We will catch you then.